Assalamu alaikum, Adnan.
Wa alaikum salam.
Welcome to Sweden.
Oh, it's great to be here with you. It's my first time in Sweden, and I have come to a very beautiful and remote part of it. It's wonderful, though.
You're most welcome, and welcome to my home as well.
Thank you for your hospitality. It's wonderful to meet you and to be in your home and have your hospitality. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This was quite quickly planned. In 2 weeks, we had like I don't know, first contact a couple months ago after the first
That's right.
lecture.
And That's right. I really enjoyed your first video.
Yeah.
Discussion with military and tactical strategic experts on Palestine. It was a great discussion. And we followed each other on Twitter for a while. So I just reached out and said, that was a great video. It's wonderful. I hope you continue doing more, and expressed an interest in meeting you. And if there's anything I can do with the Palestine Solidarity community in Sweden, since I was going to be visiting, and I'm so glad it worked out.
Yeah, me too. It's fantastic, and I'm a bit starstruck, I should say. I've been following Guerrilla History, your podcast with Henry Hakamaki. For people who haven't watched it, or rather listened to it, I definitely recommend it very warmly. It's been a great source of historic information for, I don't know how to call it, but it's like, you could actually introduce that
I'm
better.
so happy that you would recommend it to people. And it is meant to be something like a resource, using history as a resource for contemporary social justice struggles, anti-imperial struggles, equality struggles. That we have actually a history of victories, defeats, stalemates, things that we can draw inspiration from, learn lessons from. We have amazing figures who sacrificed many things that can be inspiring to us when we're facing difficulties now. And in general, it seems to me that we don't use history enough as a resource for us. If we educate ourselves historically, that can be part of our political education, as we go forward. And that's the idea behind the podcast, and that's why it's called Guerrilla History, which is the idea that we wage insurgency on the empire's history and the empire's historical narratives and ways of framing the past in order to promote their own interests, to deflate us from our resistance. We need to reimagine, reframe, and learn from history in all the ways that it can be effective and useful in guiding us. Not that we have to follow the pathways of the past, but you don't know how to chart your future without taking that into account. That's our feeling.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is used as a weapon against us.
Indeed, indeed.
So I think what you're doing is extremely valuable. And they're like small nutshells of things, and then they grow in you. I'd say they're great. So definitely check it out. Would you mind just introducing yourself a bit so that people...
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for those who don't know who I am, I'm Adnan Hussein. I'm a professor of history at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And I'm a scholar of the medieval Mediterranean world and the Islamic world, the sort of global Islamic history in the pre-modern period, or at least before the Ottoman Empire. I'm in particular interested in the intellectual, cultural, religious interactions among Jews, Christians, and Muslims in what I call the Mediterranean world. That is, parts of Southern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and what we characterize as the Middle East on the eastern end of it, as a way of thinking about looking at histories and experiences outside of the national frames, outside of the nation states, and to think of it as regional. And when we open it up that way, I'm interested in what were the real possibilities for collaboration, for cooperation, as well as for conflict. And so I study everything and teach on everything from the translation movement of Arabic language-based philosophy, theology, science into Latin, for example, that intellectual transmission, history and story of that transmission to the Crusades, and rethinking, from my perspective, why the Crusades are very important for understanding our contemporary world. They're not something that just happened in the past, they have their legacy. And so I explore that in my research and in my teaching.
Fantastic. So why did you choose this path? Because I would ask sort of how were you introduced to the question of Palestine, but they're in your case they're both intertwined. Like your academic work is
Yes.
completely involved with Palestine as well directly because of the
Yeah.
region itself. So
Well, that's right. It's odd. I mean, I think I got interested in this period because I was interested in the role of religion in society and in culture. And 30, 40 years ago, when I was a very young man, a student in high school and university, uh, you know, during those environments, especially living as a Muslim in the West, at that time, there weren't very large Muslim communities in the United States, which is where I grew up, and it's a very big country. So you always felt that you were practically alone, or there were a few of you in any place you lived. Um, so trying to situate oneself in both the West and the East, that I was a Muslim, I was raised with this, um, and yet at the same time I was being educated in Western culture in the university, and I was interested. Well, what's the relationship between these two things? How can one bring them together in one narrative rather than seeing the world is divided between East and West? Now, of course, it is. There is a lot of political problems and hegemony, but the idea that informs that is that there's a necessary difference, there's a necessary division. And this goes back to what became formalized as Samuel Huntington's theory on the clash of civilizations. But even before he coined this, picking up on Bernard Lewis's use of the term in a very important article he published, um, called The Roots of Muslim Rage, where he was trying to explain to, the American policy audience why there was really no way you could deal diplomatically, with nations of the Middle East and the Islamic world, and that they had to be, dominated by U.S. hegemony, and this was the necessary outcome. And somebody like Samuel Huntington, elaborated and formalized his theory around that. But the ideas behind that go back a long way, where people just thought that Europe developed in its own way. It happened because of its own unique genius to come to dominate the entire world for a few centuries, and that this was the end point of history. And that the East was, always backward. And even if it had some moments where it represented high points of human culture and intellectual development and scientific achievement, these were evanescent, very temporary, and undermined by the broader kind of weaknesses of and contradictions of their values, and that these were incompatible with modernity, and that once the world became modern, these were irrelevant. And even if you might look back nostalgically on some of these high points of achievement culturally and intellectually, they were the past, and it was a dead past that didn't have bearing on either the present, really, or the future of humanity. And so, trying to reconcile myself, I thought, well, what is the period where one could look at these kinds of questions and the question of religion in society? Because so often the problem was framed as Islam. And the fact that Muslims, for whatever reason, just don't seem to be able to get over Islam and become modern, and that this is the real impediment, So I was interested, well, let's take a look at the era when religion was acknowledged as very important in society, and we don't have the complicating factor of secularization and of these changes that have altered religion and, of course, supposedly reduced its sphere of significance and importance in contemporary social life, in the public sphere, in politics, and so on. So, how could I escape the kind of secularization narrative and really explore, what the world was like and what the role of religion is in human culture and development? So, I turned towards medieval history, and because I had this kind of mixed background of being somebody from the Middle East Islamic world, but growing up in the West, I was interested naturally in relations between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Um, and there were so many surprises when I started studying it. Things that Muslims didn't even know about the history of relationships. And very often, I would say, that many Muslims have adopted some of the Huntingtonian ideas themselves just from the opposite side, from the perspective that Huntington is right. It is a clash of civilizations, but it's one we have to win. So how are we going to win it? We're losing, right? This is kind of how it's framed by many of, in kind of contemporary Islamic thought. And so I was interested in different kinds of histories and approaches that might have avenues where Islam contributes to modern society, modern culture, that we don't see this radical disruption with our history and our heritage, but we're comfortable with it. Because that's one thing that I found is that people either totally romanticized it as and then nostalgized over it, that there was a period when we had this rule over the whole known world, the Abbasid Empire, but then we declined, and this kind of narrative of decline. And so we have this troubled relationship with our history, or people who wanted to reject it completely and say, yes, if we are to be modern, we have to actually change and alter everything about ourselves in order to be successful. And that, or even others who thought that science, technology were separable from the social, cultural environment. I know you're a scientist, somebody who knows a lot about computers. Very often people think that this is somehow completely separable from the cultural environment, and that it also doesn't have impacts and consequences that also have to be looked at carefully. So I was interested in a kind of more complex and holistic picture, and that's how I started getting into studying these episodes of mixed, multicultural, multi-religious societies. How did they manage to work? Under what kinds of conditions? Was it possible for Muslims, Christians, and Jews to live flourishing lives of um, acceptance of one another, even if, of course, they may theologically disagree, but that they could still have meaningful social relations, cooperation? What did that look like? And also, on the other hand, what were the consequences of periods and episodes where this idea that these are separated worlds that can only have conflict with one another? What are the consequences and legacies of that, for the future? Even though people constantly claim, particularly in a Eurocentric frame, that, well, religion doesn't mean anything to us. We're secular. It's only the Muslims who are keeping, these kind of backwards ideas, and as a result, they can't be modern. And there's a blindness to the ways in which what I would characterize as Latin Christendom, which is basically what we think of as Western Europe. It's not exactly the same borders of it, but that's the sort of historic core of Western Europe, is Latin Christendom, which is what it was called before people were talking about the secular kind of category of Europe. That just because it was secularized doesn't mean that structures were changed and erased, and there is continuity between some of them. And we have to recognize and understand that if we're to reformulate a world where we actually do live the kind of experience of real democracy, of real social justice, of equality. There's a lot more work that has to be done than just claiming that, well, we've secularized the situation. So that's kind of how I think of this medieval past as having some relevance and significance for us today. And those were the kinds of questions and problems that motivated me.
I understand. That was a great introduction. Thank you. We keep referring to, and I guess this will happen more and more, but the distinction between modern and non-modern. How do you define that?
Well, that's a thorny kind of question. In fact, the more I study, I'm not so sure there. I mean, what is the date when modernity happens? What it is I think, is that there are a lot of social relations, uh, social structures, political institutions that have severed, and economic arrangements that have severed people from previous life ways and created a sense that we are new. We are doing something new. There was a self consciousness that happened around, I would say, successive cultural developments where the West kind of congratulated itself for achievements that it had made while obscuring what the costs of those were and the manner in which they were achieved. So things like colonialism and imperialism um, are really, in some ways, the foundations for a lot of the cultural and scientific and intellectual advancements that were made simply because you can experiment and invest in these sort of spheres of life when you have all of this surplus, resources that have come through the exporting of violence, racism, and domination. And then, if you're congratulating yourself for these cultural achievements, it's basically as a mask to say these are not as a result of exploitation and expropriation. These are deserved kinds of achievements, and it's that dynamic that I would characterize as propagating an ideology of modernity that figured new forms of economy like industrial capitalism and then all the successive sort of phases of capitalism, uh, uh, individual nuclear families as like the only model by which social life and familial structures can be organized, for example, political institutions like the establishment of the nation state. So it's the development of a bureaucratic state that's rationalized as the natural expression of the political identity and will of a nation that is defined, characterized, and policed in its boundaries, where homogeneity is absolutely central and crucial for justifying the so-called universal programs or democracy and so on. So this ideology of nationalism conjoined with new developments and techniques of governance and control of populations comes together in this nation state. That is something that I can very much associate with a new condition that repatterns political life. So it's a number of it's a complex interconnection of these sorts of developments that contributes to this self-conscious ideology that the world is being made new and it's very different from the past, and actually celebrating that. Whereas in the past, a lot of times people did have a kind of conservatism. Legitimacy came from doing things, whether they did them or not, whether it actually did go back to the past or not. There were a lot of invented traditions. It's a very interesting field of history that Hobsbawm and Ranger have a very famous collection from about 40 years ago. It was called The Invention of Traditions, and they studied all kinds of things where people thought that these went back to the past, time immemorial, but in fact they were like 19th century Victorian era constructions. And so there's a use to projecting things back into the past. But that's part of a kind of conservative thinking where legitimacy comes from continuing to do things because that's the way we do things. That's our habit, our practice. That's natural to us as this culture. There's a kind of disjunction between that and this kind of really more revolutionary kind of perspective that starts to be projected of turning away from those things to create something new, and that's through the celebration of science and technology, the celebration of new forms of political affiliation like liberal democracy in a nation state. These kinds of things were consciously seen as breaks with the past, and people at that time characterized that as living in a new case of modernity. But of course, this was an experience that was framed and characterized entirely on European experience and then universalized as this is the apex of human development. It is the norm against which to judge all others. And as a result, other peoples, whether from Africa, Asia, South Asia, were essentially cast out from the community of modernity, which was basically a westernized kind of present, projecting a globalization of this in the future. That was really just a matter of enshrining in various ways and structures the relations established during colonialism and imperialism just on a kind of new basis and a seemingly more legitimate basis as the progress of human history rather than the story that some people managed to unleash incalculable levels of violence and broke up structures of cooperation, of connection, where, it wasn't that it was always fair, but there were hierarchies, but they were local hegemonies that were worked out and could be contested. That instead, this is a process by which violence was unleashed in an unprecedented sort of way to privilege certain groups of people who regarded themselves as modern nation states, who, through colonialism and imperialism dominated the world. And, it's just a kind of, we had been talking a little bit before, and I wanted to pick up on a point that you were interested in. Um, I don't see these kinds of structures that happen under colonialism and imperialism by European colonizing powers. I don't see them as empires in the same way as, for example, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or historic empires even before those, like the Achaemenid or the Sasanian empires of Persia, or even the Roman Empire. Though we could talk a little bit about that. Those land-based territorial empires, they were a community, a dynast, rules over many, many peoples, different nations, peoples, cultures. And that redounds to the glory of the emperor. And if the emperor sees that, say if you're talking about, say, the Ottoman Empire, if the emperor, sees that there is a fantastic scholar of medicine, from the Jewish community, or from the Balkans, in Serbia, or what is today Croatia. They recruit them. They bring them to their court. They become important in the circle of the dynastic empire. They don't see an impenetrable barrier between a certain privileged political community and all others. The way in that, for example, the British so-called empire, I don't think it should be called an empire, may have ruled over many different peoples, but they were a colonizing nation state. And what it meant to be an Englishman politically, in terms of your identity, was dramatically different from being another kind of subject of, Queen Victoria, for example. And you did not have people passing the barrier of if their talents or their industry kind of developed something that would be seen as interesting or useful. It didn't mean that they would themselves rise to being incorporated into that imperial system. No, the outcomes may be taken and stolen and used, but the people who produce it or do something aren't themselves ever going to be represented in, the imperial court or in the imperial governing structures. And in all these previous ones, you find a talented person will be recruited and used for the glory of the sovereign. The sovereign is not, going to turn someone away simply because they speak the wrong language or they are of the wrong religion. They are part of what redounds to the glory of the empire, is that they can take the best, from all of these different peoples. And so that's a really big difference, it seems to me. One is based on exclusion, and one is based on incorporation and subordination. Like, you're still, like, we're not talking about equality. This is not modern democracy. There's no citizens. You are subjects. But you can pass and be incorporated into these structures socially, politically, economically in ways that you don't see in European colonizing empires, colonizing.
Could you be able to say it's more fluid, like the social structures? Because I mean, you keep hearing the term social mobility, for example, like in the British Empire or the nation state, colonizing nation state, as you put it. I guess the British were always on top. Like there would never be anyone else that would dictate anything to them.
That's right. Yeah.
But you wouldn't have. I mean, other than I'm thinking about the Ottomans because that's the most I know about.
Yes.
But then you would, like, it wasn't about being Turkish. I mean, if there was any hierarchy, that was about being Muslim.
Yes,
but then it wouldn't matter which race or which.
And you can always become a Muslim if you decide, hey, look, this is the pathway forward for my future. Yeah. I believe enough, it's similar enough, and this is the way forward. You could do that, and then there's no problem. Like, you're fully incorporated. So you're right, that's one of the barriers, but it's a surmountable barrier where when it's racialized or when it's made a question of membership in a kind of imagined national community that has formed a nation state, only those people who are part of it, and are citizens of it, wield these kinds of rights and status. And if you don't have that, then there's no pathway for you, to have that kind of social and political mobility. So, for example, take a pre-Ottoman case. Under the Fatimid Empire. So it was a Ismaili Shi'i dynasty that established a dynastic state in North Africa, began pretty much in what is today Tunisia, but ended up conquering what is today Libya and Egypt and founded its new capital in Cairo, Al-Qahira. It's actually the new city that they created, the administrative capital to administer this empire. They had a huge number of Jewish viziers, so these are the people who are the chief ministers of this state, leading armies, making crucial decisions. You have the same thing happening in Al-Andalus, is that under the Umayyad, caliphate in Cordoba, that they had Jewish viziers, again, who were generals, who wielded political power. That kind of thing was not going to be happening under the French Empire, French colonial so-called empire, or the British so-called empire, or the Dutch empire. Yes, there will be people who are kind of go-betweens, lascars. These are these kind of sailors, for example, in the Indian Ocean. They appropriated the talent, but it's not like these people could then rise to becoming rulers or governors under the Portuguese or under the British. So that is, it seems to me, a very big difference between, colonizing nation states of the modern period in Europe, and in Europe's relation to the rest of the world, and other forms and structures of empire that have, great inequality and subordination. We're not, saying these are models for how we would like to see today's society organized. They are, however, indicative that some of the structures of racism, some of the structures of exclusion didn't exist. And there were some European, you could say the Byzantine Empire, or, the later Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, as some would call it, was much more like what the Ottomans, become than they were like any of the Western Latin Christian proto-nation states that become nation states, these kingdoms of France and England and so on. So it's not just about, say, religion, because they were a Christian Eastern Orthodox power. It's something happens in Europe's history. I think it's related to the Crusades, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But something happened that departs from the Mediterranean system of the, kind of economic incorporation of minorities, of religious minorities, of the accommodation of ethnic, linguistic, and other forms of difference that you don't see in this period of Europe's development being tolerated. It had a different approach and a different practice that led, in some ways, perhaps, to the willingness and the ability to unleash incredible amounts of violence where other structures might have been of cooperation, mutual benefit, trade, these sorts of things. And so when we look to the rise of Europe, the so called takeoff period in world history and world systems history and theory, I think if you ignore, the violence, the question of violence, and subordination, and all of the legacies of colonial plunder. Well, it does two things. Colonial plunder meant all kinds of resources come through, what Marx called primitive accumulation. Um, but then also structures of trade and trade imbalance, that helped Europe in its economic development. But the second part of it is you weaken and you destroy rival, sorts of powers. It's a destructive as well as a constructive of domination form of relationship. And so, if you don't account for that as part of what gave Europe an advantage developmentally and in world historical terms, in terms of its technical development and political development and so on, I think you're missing a huge part of the history, and you will mistake why it's falling apart and collapsing today because despite the rhetoric of that self-satisfied sense of we are moderns, we are the apex of human culture and development, history has continued, will continue, and we see that other older centers of world historical development are re-emerging. 40 years ago, maybe it was difficult. 50 years ago, it was difficult to project and see that China would become a global economic power, the largest economy in the world. Um, but now it's unavoidable. 15, 20 years ago, if you were ignoring it, you were just, prisoner of Western hegemonic Eurocentric ideology. I mean, and my sense is that now people can see that, but they may not actually understand and explain how and why that has happened and see that this is a blip in terms of human history. This period of 400 years, or if you want to call it that, of Europe's kind of domination of the world through colonialism, imperialism, the development of industrial capitalism, and so on, is a departure from the world systems and its history. And it's not that we're returning to like a previous world kind of system, but there is a reorientation taking place in a multipolar world that is rebalancing a period of a spike in power and development that took place in that period of history. And my hope is that I can contribute through my study of the Crusades that lays some of the basis and the foundations for that rise that happens later.
No, I think it's extremely important and interesting. I mean, otherwise I think the Western thought has sort of cultivated and got stuck in this individualistic idea of history. I mean, okay, well, now we see, oh, it's Trump, oh, it's Biden, oh, it's this person, it's that person, without any understanding of how we came here. Because if you look back, as you are doing, you can see a thread that is almost inevitably leading here. But maybe we can actually go follow that thread back to the Crusades, or maybe even just before the Crusades. Like, what was the dynamics that started the Crusades, and then slowly build up to the parallels or the structures that were created by then that affect today, and the parallels between what we call as Zionism or the settler colonialism that we see in Palestine. How we can sort of relate those two, and we can get into this.
Yeah. I mean, that's to me what is of material relevance right now when we think of what's happening in the world. I look and we see the Zionist entity is a settler colonial project that establishes itself in the Levant. It has a kind of quasi-religious, but it was a secularized version of a nationalist ethno-national, ethno-religious kind of ideology that aggrandizes a particular community to have the only real citizenship and political privilege, right? Um, that sounds to me an awful lot like the Crusader states that happened in the same region with people from a similar part of the world. I mean, in the sense that we're talking about, greater Europe. Establishing itself. And I look at this as two atypical, because they both have unique and specific features that departs from uh, it has some similarities with other settler colonial projects, whether it's the so-called French in Algeria, because it was actually just Catholics. Actually, it was a lot of people from Spain, not just people who would be part of what we think of today as France, but also islands like Corsica and Sardinia. So basically, Southern Catholic Europe provided settlers for the French settler colonial project in Algeria. Canada, New Zealand, the United States, Australia, these are settler colonial projects. South Africa, starting with the Dutch and then later under the British, displacing or subordinating the indigenous peoples as part of a kind of colonial regime of domination. So there are a lot of states, and you can study settler colonialism in history. I would argue that the Crusader states are Europe's first project that is connected with what we see in the later colonial and settler colonial worlds of the settling the Western Hemisphere, parts of Africa, and so on. And that the Zionist kind of project, with the state of Israel, is the last one. Well, inshallah, it'll be the last, but it is the latest one. And so this early proto-settler colonial and this late one are interesting in that they have similarities with settler colonialism as a whole, but they have a lot of unique features. And in some of those unique features, because they are atypical in the historical span, can be maybe talked about together, and especially since they happened in the same sort of area. So, what I want to point out is that despite some people's characterization, and it's become rather popular, despite some people's characterization, this theory, for example, like of Henri Pirenne, a Belgian historian who wrote a famous book and a series of essays upon which the book was built, that was published after his death, called Mahomet et Charlemagne. So Muhammad and Charlemagne. He argued that for understanding world history and the rise of Europe and Europe's creation of a unique identity in the trajectory and direction of its development, you had to appreciate not the fall of Rome to the German invasions, the Germanic invasions, not the Gibbon rise and decline of Rome. That is because the Germanic peoples ended up overwhelming it, and then that changed, things. He said that wasn't the crucial change in fragmenting the Mediterranean world that had been united politically, culturally, economically under the Roman Empire. He thought that the real shattering of this older world was the Muslim conquests and the Arab Muslim conquests. And why? The difference, he said, is that the Germans sort of assimilated themselves to Romanitas. They saw themselves as like barbarian conquerors of a settled, more advanced culture and civilization, and they wanted to style themselves, at least in part, as continuators of it or as legitimate in those terms. And so they cultivated titles and other things that harkened back to Roman titles and so on. And he argued that they were starting to still maintain some kind of trade links across the Mediterranean and so on. But this got all destroyed and disrupted under the Arab Muslim conquest, because unlike these Germans who kind of assimilated to Romanness and adopted the religion of the Romans, the Arabs didn't do that. They didn't recognize, oh, we're barbarians and we're conquering this more advanced culture, and we should try and be like them if we're going to rule over the Near East, Eastern Mediterranean. And he said what prevented them from doing that was Islam. They came with their own religion, and instead of kind of becoming converts to a form of Christianity that was dominant in the settled regions of the world that they came to rule, they imposed this their own, and they kept themselves separate from it. And this shattered the world of the Mediterranean. And so then Europe becomes Europe the way it becomes, which is Charlemagne. So you have Muhammad, and as a result, that leads to Charlemagne. So this particular form of the Latin West, the Holy Roman Empire, the Carolingian Empire, as the ladder upon which medieval Europe was built and subsequently Europe. And so he said that sent it off in this other direction. So,
sorry, just so Charlemagne, and you just quickly.
okay, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Germanic, Frankish. The Franks are actually a German people, so he was like ruler of the Franks, but he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, and he ruled a fairly vast territory of what we think of Western Europe, parts of northern Spain, okay, not the British Isles, but parts of northern Spain, what is today France, Germany, and much of Italy, at least the northern part of Italy, whereas the Byzantines continued to rule parts of southern Italy, Sicily, and other things in the Mediterranean. And that was his whole point, is that Charles the Great built the foundations of this Carolingian Empire, as it's called, named after Charles the Great, and the successor states after it broke up, and the continuation of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, in the Germanic kind of regions afterwards, as a non-kind of Mediterranean power. They were sort of cut off from the Mediterranean world the way the Roman Empire had integrated it, and they went on their own pathway of development that synthesized, these Germanic kind of understandings of law and society and social relations and so on, and was the kind of a different way of of organizing. And it took a long time before cities and urban society developed, and it was a different kind of form of society and culture that was very influential for what would become Europe, especially Western Europe, is that it was built upon that. Monasteries and the church, agrarian cultivation, and less of this trade in the Mediterranean, and less Roman, ideas and Roman law and so on. So that's who Charles the Great was.
When was he?
Oh, he's crowned. I believe it's 800, 801. See in the Common Era, and I forget his death date, but it's not soon after that. So we're talking about 8th and early 9th centuries. Is a kind of repercussion he sees as a consequence of the early Muslim conquests in the 7th and early 8th centuries, basically. That's a kind of common sort of view, and it fits into with the clash of civilizations. The worlds are separate, and they don't have any relationship with one another. What we see, however, is on the cusp of the Crusades, in the century and a half before that, you have the start of Italian merchant cities that are engaged in trade, like Amalfi, that are involved in a kind of cooperative trade between Egypt and the Levant with the Byzantines. And nobody has heard of the Amalfi state, really. I mean, it's pretty obscure. And the reason why you haven't heard of them, but you have heard of Genoa and of Venice, who come to dominate maritime trade and naval control of the Mediterranean, shipping, and so on, and the wealth that was created. The reason why you hear about them, I would argue, is that they adopted the crusading model, and they participated and collaborated with the Crusades, and departed from the Amalfitan sort of model, which was, networking, cooperation, a kind of triangle trade, integrating Byzantium and integrating the Eastern Mediterranean and making the Amalfi, coast as a kind of trading entrepot and node of interchange between these two other structures, and providing services and shipping and so on to connect those regions better. So my point here is that there were choices and there were options. They weren't worlds apart. There were actual interconnections taking place. These are shattered not by the Muslim conquest. They are shattered by a new approach to organizing economy, of pursuing their interests, that comes along with both kind of conceptions of religion and religious community and political identity and violent warfare against the enemies of Christ. This was a way of mobilizing and monetizing a society that was like, even before feudalism was kind of like a development on top of this society, but this kind of smaller scale agrarian, not much mercantile trade and traffic, because actually at that point Europe didn't have much to offer, to the Eastern Mediterranean, to North Africa, to further east. What they had to offer was things like timber, some metals, iron, ore, and actually people, slaves. So they would enslave. Charlemagne's wars against the Slavs. In fact, the very word Slav comes from of slaves comes from Slavs. Because they were non-Christians, pagans. These are wars that are often characterized, first against the Saxons and against others who were Slavic peoples, were characterized as wars for conversion. Well, maybe not. But what they were wars of plunder in human resources, in enslaved people, and then selling them in the Mediterranean, to the Byzantines, to the Islamic, empires, and so on. So that's not exactly a basis for development of a kind of thriving, complex economy.
Just to intervene, sorry, it sounds a bit inverted to colonial nature of today.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. But they were in a sort of peripheral region. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Well, what we have today, unfortunately, is with automation, with the organization of capital and industry, now you have surplus populations. So they exported and exploited, labor in the global South. But now that has achieved a certain level where now we have surplus populations whose main concern is that these are people who now have nothing. We can't keep them there to be working, for surplus value in our sweatshops and our IT, fabrication, to make computer chips and things like that. It's robotics. It's all being done. We've got all these extra people who are hungry, desperate, and suffering climate catastrophe. They're going to come to our shores, and we're making wars in their countries. They're going to come to our shores. So the big problem here is, how do we wall ourselves off? How do we create fortress Europe? And I would argue that goes back to this idea of Christendom as a walled garden. I mean, you have Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister of the EU, as it were, right, saying Europe is a garden. And it needs a big wall because the rest of the world is a jungle. And the jungle animals are going to come and invade this lovely little garden. Well, this is the kind of conception that is coterminous with the launching of the Crusades. You don't see a lot of people talking about Christendom as a kind of territorial unit, as a kind of conception of religio-political community, really very much before the Crusades. You might get a little bit of this during the era of the Reformed popes, who are also the ones who author the idea that we need to, intervene. And there's several popes before Urban II actually announces at Clermont in 1095 the launching of the First Crusade. This is in papal discussion and correspondence that we may need to, have an armed intervention to save our brothers in the East, Christians who have been subjected to Muslim rule. This was seen as intolerable, that they must be suffering horribly, and they need to be freed. And this goes along with developing more ideas through increasing pilgrimage to the Holy Land to Palestine, of characterizing it as the Holy Land for Christians, that that this idea of Jerusalem that was the heavenly Jerusalem, the kingdom of heaven. Jesus, the whole point of Christianity is, well, we don't need to be worrying about this terrestrial, carnal, corporeal, physical existence. This conversion, the Messiah, has come not to establish a kingdom on earth, but it is to, take us to the kingdom of heaven. So when they talked about Jerusalem, they talked about Jerusalem as the heavenly place, that every monastery actually created an analogy through, its pious behavior of a community living together, created a heavenly Jerusalem among them. What they started thinking was, like, no, maybe we need to make it territorial and we have to intervene. And this is a holy land that is an inheritance of Christ, and it belongs to us as Christians. And so we need to go take it back because it's our ancestral land. Sounds a little familiar, right? With a narrative of Jews and Hebrews, is that what they did was they appropriate, instead of allegorizing and spiritualizing, which is the basis of Christianity, allegorizing and spiritualizing the Hebrew Bible and the kind of Old Testament, what are called Old Testament narratives, um, they appropriated as we are actually the chosen people. And so you see in some of the early Crusades sources, they call the Franks, you Franks, you are the most Christian people. You are God's chosen people, and you have a holy mission in history to fulfill and achieve this. So they end up actually taking this as a kind of what we might call an ideology of settler colonialism. It's Christian Zionism, not the later Christian Zionism, which is that the Jews all have to go back, that led to Protestant support for, and in fact, it was far before, decades before the actual Jewish World Zionist Congress, there was Christian Zionist, conferences and things going on. But that is a variant. We could talk a little bit about that. I have some thoughts on it, but it's not my area. But I think of this as the real Christian Zionism, is taking the idea that this territory belongs to us, and we are the Jews. We are the real Hebrews. And what this did is it meant these real Jews, they no longer should be existing. It used to be they had a place in Christian society, according to Augustine's doctrine of witness, that they keep and preserve the Hebrew Bible, what he calls the Old Testament, in its literal form. And anybody who reads it, he thought, you can see that it's all telling about the coming of Christ, and you could read everything like the binding of Isaac is the crucifixion narrative. It's an allegory. It's a spiritual allegory for Christ, and that's how you have to read that. But they can't see it. The Jews can't see it. They're prevented. They're blinded from being able to see this. But anybody else who looks at it would say, this is so obvious. This is about Christ. And so they can see the truth. So they're spread throughout the world through diaspora. They no longer have a political power and a home. Their kingdoms are over. They're in diaspora. They're spread throughout the world so that they can bear witness to the truth of the Christian mission. And so we can respect them, in the sense that they are fulfilling some reasonable mission in Christianity. They have to be subordinates to Christians, but don't kill them. You can tolerate them. That was the prevailing doctrine. What starts to happen during the crusading era is like, no, they are also enemies of Christ. We're going to go fight these Saracens that they called the Muslims, who are ruling and polluting and corrupting the Holy Land and oppressing our brethren. And Christ is suffering because his holy place is under the rule of these terrible people. But those are enemies. They're pretty far away. We've got some enemies here, and we should, destroy them. And so you find that the first wave of preaching the Crusades unleashed the first really, really huge. I mean, there's one period earlier that also has to do with connection with Muslims, of being upset with Muslims, that led to some wide-scale oppression of Jews and slaughter of Jews in Europe. But the first really notable wide-scale massacres of Jews and pogroms happens in organizing the First Crusade in the Rhineland cities, and elsewhere. It spreads. And after that, every time a new crusade is being organized and preached and mobilized, you end up having massacres of Jews. And so there's an association between Jews and Muslims as enemies of Christ. They're an internal, group that is undermining Christian society. And there's a rival culture and civilization that is dominating the world that has to be stopped. And these people who are inside and enemies of Christ are in league with those powers outside. And so, just as we go and we slaughter Muslims and try and liberate the Holy Land, we should cleanse Christian society of these polluting groups. So you have heretics start to be suppressed more, and Jews. There's a transformation in the relationship between Christian society and Jews. So this concept of Christendom as a kind of sacred holy territory itself is something that is a product of the crusading society, I would call it. And it has all these consequences of a kind of mobilization for war of the whole society for 2 centuries, right? If you think of 1095 to 1291, of course, it doesn't even end there, but I give an endpoint of 1291, which is the end of the last Crusader state in the Levant, in Palestine. In Acre, the last one is defeated in 1291. That's like 2 centuries, basically, of constant emergency, of constant crisis, of having to confront this powerful enemy outside and suppressing dissent and persecuting, people within. This is the dynamic that I see is forged as a result of what I call the creation of a crusading society, that is, this society dedicated to this form of war and exclusion that I think has major, major consequences for Europe's approach to politics, Europe's approach to religious or ethnic kind of difference, and has a legacy that I see as the interrelationship between suppression of dissent, persecution of Jews through anti-Semitism, and linking Jews to some wider global conspiracy against us, against Christianity, against Christian society, against Christendom as a holy sort of political unit, and a society dedicated to trying to confront the Muslim, the paradigmatic enemy and rival for global domination, which is obviously the rise of Islamophobia.
Okay, that was again a great intervention. So just to take that argument away from people who might be thinking, "Oh, he said the Christians were oppressed in under Muslim rule." I mean, that was one of the motivations for the Crusades. But was there any basis for it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex question in the sense that any dynastic pre-modern state where you have a sultan or a king or an emperor is unequal, and there are privileged communities who enjoy rights that some of the other minorities don't have. It doesn't mean they're totally excluded from everything. They can participate, for example, in the economy. I mentioned some examples where religious minorities actually furnished and provided important political leaders in some regimes. But you could also have cases where there might be a ruler might come in who sees that there have been transgressions of the subordination of Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, that they're rising above their station, and as a result there might be some periods of political suppression and so on. But what you don't have is forced conversion, cases of forced conversion. Very rare. You have a couple of cases here or there. You have, for example, a millenarian messianic movement, the Al-Muwahidun movement in North Africa, that ends up ruling for part of the part of Spain in the 12th and 13th centuries, that regarded Muslims, regular Maliki Muslims, as not real Muslims and wanted to kind of force them to change. It also said, well, this era of the Pact of Omar, where we tolerate the Ahl Dhimma, the protected peoples, the Ahl Kitab, the people of the book, where they have the ability to continue their religion, to have their own religious leadership and follow their own religious laws, participate in the economy, but they don't have rights of being part of the military, for example, and they can't be the ruler of the whole society. Now, practically, they could be the rulers. They could be viziers and so on, as I was mentioning. But the sovereign has to be a Muslim, right? This was kind of the way they understood this relationship, but it allowed for the flourishing of these communities and their relative autonomy over their own social and religious affairs, and without the problem of economic exclusion that you see, for example, that happened increasingly in Europe, where Jews were forced into kind of small-scale mercantile peddling, were prevented from, land ownership and being kind of peasantry, and forced into usurious lending, which was a hated profession, and so on. So you didn't have that kind of enforced economic isolation of religious minorities. So it's a very different kind of situation than we would sort of picture. Um, uh, but of course, there were always episodes where there might be unfairness or persecution might happen. But what you don't have, as I was trying to say before I kind of got onto some interesting specifics, is you don't have structures of large scale, widespread forced conversion of these communities, unlike what you have in the West and the Iberian Peninsula, for example, Jews and Muslims forcibly converted. You also don't have expulsion of populations. Now, sovereigns might relocate populations from one part of their lands to another where they thought we need a workforce here. We are going to have all these people move and they're going to build some big qanat, kind of irrigation works and stuff so we can make, zira, this area under cultivation and so on. They might do things like that. But they never thought of populations as completely surplus or as a danger that had to be expelled, right? You might have some groups that fight and rise in rebellion, and then they are exiles because they cannot stay within the sovereignty of the person they've rose in rebellion. But you don't have just the expulsion of populations because of who they are, right? So I would say that you have a much more integrative and inclusive situation in the Muslim world where there is a different kind of pattern of social relationship that we're not going to say these are equal, these communities have full equality. The one other thing that starts to happen during this period, however, is that Muslims and the Muslim peasantry are also increasingly subordinate as they become the majority of these societies. These are highly stratified, oligarchic, rule by tyrants, military tyrants. I mean, and they oppress everybody as a result of that. And the status of Muslims actually increasingly goes down, like say Arab Muslims or Persian speaking Muslims, and they're ruled increasingly by a tribal ruling class, or in North Africa, Amazigh tribal communities that formed powerful dynastic states. The rest of the population then is under a kind of subordination of exacting terrible taxes, of living difficult lives, of sometimes being, forced into military kinds of service and things like that. So I would say that you can't characterize the treatment of Jews and Christians as somehow generally and particularly as a kind of vicious form of persecution. There are only episodes that may happen when, like, an elite family that happened to be Christian, for example, might run afoul of a certain sultan or caliph or ruler, and then they might suppress that family, just as actually they would do, for like a Persian bureaucratic family of Muslims that were seen as getting too powerful and need to be kind of liquidated or controlled. So, but I think what's important actually about this is less whether it was true or not. I don't think you can make the fair case. But what's interesting to me is how it set a kind of precedent, this idea of intervention, the idea that there are communities who, have only in common is that they have a similar religion. They might even actually not be Catholics, they're Eastern Orthodox and they're non-Chalcedonian Christians, Jacobites, what we used to be called the Church Nestorians, but we now call them Church of the East. They're Copts. There's a whole huge variety that don't accord and agree. They have their own internal differences with Catholic Christians who appointed the popes and the Latin West as the protectors of these, people. But what's established is this idea that the Pope has some sort of universal jurisdiction for these minority populations that are living under somebody else's sovereignty in the East, and that justify humanitarian intervention to save them, to help them. And so I would argue, and something I'm hoping to make as an argument in the book that I'm writing about this, is that the basis, you might say, the ideological and legal basis for these humanitarian interventions, the responsibility to protect that we see happening in international law, that is only used when these imperialist Western powers have a community that gives them the opportunity to intervene and establish the political and social and economic relations of hegemony that they are interested in. They use this as a justification. We see that being developed and legitimized early on in the era of the Crusades, the idea that we're doing this out of charity, caritas, out of love. In fact, there's a famous historian, Jonathan Riley Smith from Oxford. He's passed away, but he was probably the most powerful and important historian of the Crusades in the second half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. He wrote a famous article called Crusading as an Act of Love. They weren't doing it for, control and for land and for commerce. They're doing it out of this charitable act of trying to help their fellow Christians, right? This act of charity. And so you can see there's this kind of ideological basis that then and now is being characterized as the natural condition of the Western that they are to intervene to set the world aright, and they have a special responsibility to intervene for their co-religionists or the people who are downtrodden and so on. And so we see how the ideology of humanitarian intervention, I don't see anybody calling for, you can't even call, it seems, for an end to arms sales to Israel, much less if you were going to, put in place the responsibility to protect when there's a genocide. And after the Rwandan genocide, everyone in the West was bemoaning, yes, we need better, stronger structures. We were too late. Next time we have to intervene. Well, what did you do in Bosnia? Nothing. What are you doing now to say you don't even think of them as victims of genocide? And certainly you wouldn't rise to humanitarian intervention. So we can see, I think, what's important in the history of the Crusades is falsifying history or mischaracterizing history in order to ground a narrative that establishes principles of Western hegemony and domination that are then universalized as principles of international law, or kind of the international order, how it's supposed to be organized, on which principles. And these are always principles that come out of their own particular experience and are applied in a completely hypocritical and narrow way, while the pretense of their universality is being promoted.
Yeah, they can't even so what I understand from you is that the basis for what we call the international law can be correlated to the Crusades themselves, but also like they have even left that behind. Now it's about the rules-based order.
Well, that's
it's
true.
Not international
it's
law.
It's not even international law.
Because now when you codify it, you can actually find ways to incorporate it in your struggle.
Like we've seen at the ICJ,
exactly.
That's right. It becomes an embarrassment because this is not the intention.
Exactly.
As they told, who did they tell? Somebody I think maybe it was the ICC. He is this Karim Khan. He's terrible. But he did spill the beans a little bit on, the genuine politics and situation when he said, well, I received some pushback when I was contemplating and organizing these charges against Israel. I think it was Netanyahu and Gallant. Yeah, only those two. Not even the whole war cabinet. No. You should have put, but they wanted to rehabilitate Gantz, to parachute him in later.
Yeah, and he also added Hamas.
Well, of course, totally.
It has to be both sides
right.
always.
That's right. But even that much Okay, he was told, look, this is supposed to be for Africans and, people who are enemies of Europe and the West. I mean, what are you doing? You forgot what this is about. So the gap between the universal promotion, the sort of the characterized and represented universality of these principles, and the actual historical development of them exposes, I think, what's really happening. And you can only see that. You can see that there's a hypocrisy. The question is why and how did this become the norms? And of course, part of it is because the victors create the rules, they set the narratives, but they have a history of doing this. I'm not going to say all of international law derives from the Crusades, but this was the first European project, Europe-wide, Latin Christendom. It's the first European project. Somebody from this country, in the 11th century, 12th century. I'm thinking of a case of a sovereign of Norway who joined the aftermath of the First Crusade, the 1102 kind of reinforcement after they had successfully conquered these states, but they didn't have the army and the population to really consolidate these victories. They were under threat, and so there were some new they called for aid, and there were new missions that were organized quickly. Sometimes it's called the Crusade of 1102, even though they don't call it like the Second Crusade. It's part of sort of the unfolding of the First Crusade. But you have Sigurd of Norway. He joins, this kind of 1102 crusade. You have people from northern Spain, southern France, places in Italy, in what is today Switzerland, people from England. This is a European project. What it was is it created what is the political elite's culture and service to this kind of and obligations of service to Christendom as well. You've got to go on crusade. If you can't go on crusade, you have to raise money. And so the first forms of taxation that are not just military service or customs duties where I control this bridge, you want to cross the bridge, you got to pay a tolls and things, but actual tax as like, you have this amount of wealth or you have this amount of income, you have to give me a certain amount. That only comes with the Crusades, apart from the church, who always was able to take a tithe. They took a tenth, right? You never had aristocrats and the nobility being subjected to a regime of taxation. It was only under the extraordinary circumstances and the emergency of crusade and the fact that it was so expensive and you needed to equip people and send them far away, and the feudal arrangements of military service. You're a lord, I let you have this land, but then you have to equip yourself, spend your time training, get a horse, get some armor, and then for 3 months out of the year, you have to come and fight in the wars that I'm pursuing. Well, that's not very useful for a sovereign who wants to be able to have a standing army. So they want to hire mercenaries. They need to pay people. That's hugely costly. And so you need to raise money. Well, the Crusades was the first time you could really, these royal sovereigns could say, well, Pope, you want us to go on crusade, you got to give me concessions for how, and you have to authorize and help me. And so you have, for example, for the Third Crusade, Henry II, he ends up dying beforehand, and Philip Augustus of France are given a concession where they can take a tenth as well of movable goods. It's like an income tax. It's like the first income tax. And it even was called the Saladin tithe, right? Salah ad-Din, because he's conquered Jerusalem, because they defeated the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem's armies at the Battle of Hattin, and captured the True Cross, as it was called. This was a catastrophe, another emergency. The First Crusade was successful. All the other ones basically were unsuccessful. And as a result, there was this constant sense of emergency. We have to go and support our frontier state, inhabiting the Levant, Palestine, holding back the Saracen hordes, the Muslim hordes, right? It's the frontier state. The Crusader states are the frontier state, just as the Zionist entity is the frontier state of Western empire and domination of the region. So it's a constant emergency. We have to support them. And so we have to raise the money. And so this justified, that even nobles who would hate to pay, it was against their dignity. They're warriors. They don't pay, they looked at it as tribute. Right? I'm not a conquered person. I'm a military conqueror. I don't pay tax. I offer you my military service. That was feudalism in a kind of simplistic sort of way. So some of these things that were progress for statecraft are established under the extraordinary circumstances and under the legitimizing effect of crusade and of building a crusading society. So when we think of the international order, when we think of principles of law and jurisprudence, when we think of statecraft, we have to integrate crusading into these developments that took place in Europe, without which it would have been a much longer, tortuous path. We don't know if they would have succeeded in doing these kinds of things, but the crusade gave them the impetus to alter society and to enforce new regimes of rulership, of taxation, of extraction, and of course to attempt conquest. I mean, it's very interesting. It's always talked about this, the ideological and the religious dimensions. But of course, there were also material interests that were at play. And Europe, as it's starting to develop, sees that it is on the outside of a network of trading, caravan routes, trade routes, that it doesn't have access to maritime ones as well in the Indian Ocean. You have traders already in the 11th and 12th century, Arab traders, Persian traders that are making their way all the way to China. And you have Ibn Battuta, who writes his travelogue. And already, even in the early 14th century, he's, visiting communities of diasporic Muslim merchants who are operating in southern coastal Chinese cities. So there's a whole network across the Malay Peninsula, Indonesia, from Southeast Asia all the way to the Indian Ocean that links then West Asia into North Africa, Europe, and so on. They wanted access into this. They wanted to be part of this network of trade, and the Latin Crusader kingdom gave them an entrepot, a trading entrepot, at the end point of these into the Mediterranean, so that they could start controlling trade in the Mediterranean. But they were also interested in getting into the Red Sea. So ever since the Third Crusade, and even before the Third Crusade, the Latin Crusader kingdoms were interested in conquering Egypt. And Richard I, he didn't go and lay siege to Jerusalem, which they had lost to Salah ad-Din. But he did go down to Ascalon, and he started trying to make preparations, it seems, maybe for an invasion of Egypt. The Fourth Crusade that ended up conquering Constantinople and establishing the Latin Empire, Byzantine Empire. They basically took over the Byzantine Empire for about 60 years. It originally was supposed to assault the coast of Egypt. And the Fifth Crusade did assault the coast of Egypt. It was defeated. And then Louis IX in the 1249, 1250, in his crusade, again, invaded Egypt. So they were clearly interested in a wider geopolitical terrain. And you can see that there were territorial ambitions, have access into the Red Sea. They thought of Jerusalem as the center of the world, and if they could control that area geopolitically, that would be the basis for a universal empire. The first Crusaders sent a letter back to the Pope and said, we've conquered Jerusalem, which is the center of the world, and we look forward to the expansion from sea to sea. Right? So is this universalist, borderless, right? Israel has never declared its borders, right? It's not clear. What is Israel supposed to be? Well, you talk to these extreme right-wing kind of Zionists, they're saying to the Euphrates, at least we have to have the River Jordan, and we need to have maybe parts of, we have to have the Litani River, we have to have southern Lebanon. This is like the paradigm of the Crusader states. So that's what I would argue, is that so many things, I'm not saying it's a one-to-one correspondence, but you can see the roots, the germ of ideas, of practices, of new ways of organizing that have consequences for the world that we inhabit today, and in which we can place the European and the Western hegemonic project that makes, I think, more than just an analogy that, wow, isn't it interesting that there are these similarities between, the Zionist state of Israel as a frontier Western state. This is how they are trying to portray and justify themselves, is that we are, the forward line of a confrontation with the Muslim world. Well, that goes back to something that was the crucible of the Crusades created that as a paradigm, I would say, of Western geopolitical thinking.
Would you say that's why there's this unyielding Western support for Israel? I mean, one aspect of it. I mean, there's obviously like imperialism and how Israel is um, sort of the extended arm or the spearhead of British, French, and then later now the US imperialism in the region. But is there an aspect that sort of connects the Crusader culture that permeates today without them knowing it, maybe?
Yeah, but that maybe is not conscious or conceived expressly and explicitly because they think they live in a secular world. And so my argument is that secularism in Europe was really just the kind of secularizing of Christian culture. It just took God out, but a lot of the structures stay. Maybe nobody believes and goes to church, but Sunday still has to be your holiday, your day of rest. Christmas is always a holiday, even if even if it's not about going to church and thinking about the birth of Jesus. Although, and Easter, so despite secularity, there are continuities in the culture, and I would say likewise that conceiving of Europe as a secularized version of Latin Christendom allows us to see the interventions, the wars, the global war on terrorism, as functionally inhabiting the same place, even if ideologically it's not configured in exactly the same way, with Christian identity and culture as the explicit basis of its organization. But practically speaking, that is the culture that has been normalized through that history, even though it's been secularized. And that it covers over and hides that it has that longer durée, long basis. I mean, and this is how we have to explain things like the global war on terrorism. It's how we have to explain the absolute uh, loyalty, it seems, to this kind of project of the Zionist state of Israel, is that it connects with something that is deep within, and I would argue it's the anti-Semitism, it's the Islamophobia, it's this crusading culture that is deep within Europe's historical unfolding and development, that it was there and available, so that even when it's kind of suppressed or not apparently that important, it can be resurfaced and recharged with new meaning. Like the idea that, okay, we're facing immigrant invasion of Islam, the Islamification of Europe, Eurabia, etc. It goes back to these kinds of ideas where what they are doing is calling for, we need to have something like crusade against them. We need to, they had the same idea. They persecuted the Jews because in medieval Europe, because they saw them as an inimical, dangerous threat to Christian society. This is where things like the blood libel were invented, was the idea that Jews are malevolently organizing a way to perform these horrific kind of sacrifice rituals where they steal a Christian boy, murder him, and then use the blood to make the matzah, the counter wafer to the Eucharist. And they do their kind of anti-Christian, kind of devilish inspired things that are a threat. They had the idea that they were poisoning the wells. When the plague breaks out, they scapegoated Jews, and in fact they also fabricated the idea, and again, when they were organizing a crusade, the Shepherd's Crusade, a populist crusade by people. This one was not organized by the rulers or called explicitly by the Pope, but they'd seen the failures of previous crusading, and there was a popular enthusiasm to do something about it. The Shepherd's Crusade, the Pastoreau, they, saw Jews, Templars, and Muslims as in league with one another, poisoning the wells, leading to plague. This is where witchcraft trials come out. It becomes part of the logic of persecution, is finding the scapegoat because we feel persecuted. Even though we're powerful and all, we feel like we are victims. And you see this in right-wing logic today, right?
Yeah,
It's like,
especially the US.
yeah. Well, I think across
Yeah,
Europe, in
yeah,
which you see the
yeah.
rise of these right wing, is that they feel we are victims of
absolutely.
like some kind of immigration. They're trying to take over our society and culture. And so they're ready to persecute day laborers and people who have nothing, right? And have no consciousness for, well, what did we do to the world through colonialism, imperialism? If these people are coming, it's because we destroyed their societies. We underdeveloped their societies. This is like the history of cotton, for example, is so fascinating in this. Indian weaving was impossible to compete with for the English. We hear about like the mills in Manchester, and Marx went and studied them. And where did this the genius of European organization and all that? No, what they did is they destroyed the Indian weaving cottage industries because they could not compete with it. And how could they compete with it? We're talking about 3,000 years of weaving and of artisanry over so much time. So of course they had traditions of expertise. How, if you're starting to try and get into cotton weaving, how are you going to compete with them? You cannot. How are you going to grow better cotton than they had in Egypt? They've been doing it for, 2,000, 3,000 years. So in order to jump the development chain, as it were, is unleash the violence, So you kill, you slaughter, you allot famine by controlling, there's Victorian Holocaust, as Mike Davis has studied, where, these are engineered famines that where people like Winston Churchill, just genocidal kind of logic. It's part of that. You don't have to pay any attention to that. No, we are victims because the people from the places we have destroyed, and we've had wars for centuries, and even in the last 20, 30 years with the global war on terrorism in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, overturning their regimes, unleashing, holy terror upon them. And then now we're going to say we're victims because these people are coming, and, society doesn't look the way it did, supposedly 50, years ago. So I see that the right-wing logics follow this kind of conspiratorial sense of persecution. The persecution of others is justified by the victimhood mentality that they've fabricated in their imagination of fearing the unholy influence and pollution and malefaction of these heretics, of the Jews, and always imagining Muslim power, which actually during the time it was very strong. I mean, Peter the Venerable was one of the kind of ideologues of the Second Crusade and is the first person to have had sponsored the translation of the Quran into Latin and other Muslim texts. And he wrote polemics against, Islam and Muslims, as well as against Jews and against heretics. So his career is quite interesting. He's the most important and famous abbot of the monastery Cluny in the Latin West in the 12th century. He said in several of his works, he said, these Muslims, they control 2/3, 3/4 of the world. We've only been left with this little bit of Europe, and not even all of it, because Spain is under, and so we're being persecuted. So yeah, Muslim power was, strong, obviously, during this pre-modern period, but again, there was no danger of anything really happening to them, but they fabricated this idea that we are being persecuted, which justifies us unleashing violence and persecution on them, internally, domestically, and through wars and organizing for wars abroad and against them.
And that victimhood is extremely central as well in the Zionist project.
Again, and because they were persecuted and made victims of European anti-Semitism. But what's happened is that, I see it as like this very interesting case where, the Christians became the Jews. They decided to take over that narrative of being, and what that meant is that the Jews were to be despised, subordinated, unequal. Eventually, what happens is that as they appropriated that narrative of we're the real Hebrews, we're the chosen people, and we're going to territorialize this, is that they started persecuting Jews in a very vicious sort of way. Eliminationists as enemies of Christ, said that they're deicides, they killed Christ, they killed God, and they're in league with the Muslims, they're poisoning us, they don't even follow the Old Testament law, because there's something called the Talmud. When they discover the Talmud, they try it for heresy and condemn and burn it, because it's different from what literally should be, according to them, Mosaic law, what you have in the Bible. They've got their commentaries, and this extra scriptural knowledge means that these contemporary Jews we have in our society are heretics compared to the Mosaic Jews, right? So they created this kind of persecutory kind of approach, made them victims, and the logics then were appropriated and adopted by Zionists. It's both it's nationalism, but it's also colonialism. It's the idea, how can we be accepted as modern Western Europeans? The only way we can do that is to effect a transformation and become colonizers outside of Europe, and create ourselves as a European type population that confronts the Muslims, confronts the indigenous, subordinates the peoples of the global south. They are colonizable, so we must colonize them. And that transforms us from being the despised, hated Jew object of anti-Semitism into the Zionist European. It's a new Jew. It's a transformation. And I would argue it's a transformation that draws upon not just what we think of as colonialism and settler colonialism, but this kind of Christianized crusading paradigm of how do you become the chosen people, is wage war against the Muslims, subordinate them, conquer this land, and then you can be part of this community. So what they've done is, you could argue in some ways that it's a kind of secular Christianization of the Jew, right, to transform them from being the Jew that was the despised object of persecution, into a European who's part of history, who's part of modernity, who's enlightened. But you can only do that if you go outside of Europe. You leave Europe and you confront the Muslim as like the new crusaders. And this fits so perfectly with the right-wing logics in Europe. These right-wing parties, why is Viktor Orban, and why are, Alternative for Deutschland, and like whatever, all of these far right, groupings that are emerging as strong political forces in Europe, they're so pro-Zionist.
They love Israel.
They love Israel because it solves the Jewish question. It solves the Jewish problem. Plus, they are like a crusader state. They can do colonialism, which now is not allowed, right? We had to give up our colonies and empires and all of that. So there's almost this fetishization. They get to do it, and we can live through them. They are a frontline Western state. They represent us. That's why we support them. They represent us and our project in ways that we can't do explicitly. We can only do through the World Bank and the IMF and, occasional wars and interventions that are surreptitious, and we have to worry about, how does this fit under, international law, blah, blah. But they can fulfill this crusading kind of approach and mentality. And thus they transform themselves into Westerners as the crusaders in a new form.
It's like a Western frontier settlement.
Yes,
basically.
yeah.
And all of that, there's also a lot of literature within Zionist literature. The early European Zionists, they did despise the Jew. The non-European one. So they, as you say, they wanted to modernize and make a new, strong Jew, not weak, not ugly, not despised.
Exactly. The way to do it was to be a colonizer somewhere else, and that's how you could become European. That's how you could be part of Europe, of Europe's project.
Yeah. Thank you. We have, I think it's been 1.5 hours, something like that. There are a couple questions that I had. If you want to continue a bit more, we can, or we can just. We talked about nationalism. and I keep seeing people talking about nationalism as a general thing to sort of hate. But there's also the other aspect, the national liberation aspect of things. So how do we sort of reconcile those two things? Because like Palestine, the question of Palestine, it's a national liberation question. That's what Hamas themselves call themselves, and every single Palestinian liberation organization have called themselves a national liberation organization as well. And you could see that in African decolonization as well. Uh, but is that nationalism as well, or are there
Yeah.
good nationalisms and bad nationalisms? And
This is a great question. It's not one I have an answer that I'm satisfied with myself. I think it's something that I keep thinking about and worrying over, is how to distinguish between national liberation and nationalism, because I see one as quite negative and the other as necessary for human liberation. But what is the framework under which, it can happen, and what are the dangers and the threats, or what Fanon called the pitfalls of national consciousness? What are the kind of potential problems of a national liberation movement, of the construction of a national culture, the idea of yourselves as a people that is framed dialectically by being colonized, and that this avenue of national self-determination and sovereignty is the auspices under which you can and are required, almost, it seems. I mean, what else are structures are available for a kind of liberation movement of anti-colonial or decolonization, of anti-colonial struggle and resistance and decolonization? So this is kind of a big, it seems to me, problem. What I would say when we talk and we look at the case for Palestine, for example, is that it needs to be. Wow, it's raining really hard now.
yeah.
Sudden. Well, I mean, Fanon did say that there would be pitfalls of this, and it will create. He worried. One of the things he worried about was it creating a kind of national elite and representational class of people that would occlude class politics, which he thought had to be modified under colonialism and under, the kind of regime of the racial underpinnings of colonialism, that are part of what people think of as racial capitalism, how capitalism actually works by exploiting racial difference and so on. He thought that it might create people who would occlude post liberation class struggle, and the system, the position in which these new post-colonial societies would have under the global order was not one that would be conducive for equalizing these things, and that the ideal of national development would be used to impose huge amounts of sacrifice on people to support the national project in insupportable, unsustainable ways that could reproduce colonial structures of control and domination. And in fact, actually, he was very prescient. We ended up seeing that happening. And so this is the real danger. It's like, well, you're struggling for liberation, but if the very form in which you're struggling for liberation is going to lead to a political victory of some kind, but the continuation of other forms of subordination, that's not true freedom. That's not true liberation. And he was concerned and worried about that. And in his epilogue, he talks about, what he's envisioning and his call for a new human. We need the Europeans to actually become human, is what he's sort of arguing, to have a real humanism, not to become human, but to have a real humanism. They've got a fake humanism. And so I think that is a real kind of issue. And I think when it comes to the Palestinian kind of case, it is definitely a national liberation cause, but we see that many of those who are in the position of representing the struggle for liberation and the national struggle as a national struggle are people who have a particular positionality in the global system. It's not, the interests and the views of just the whole population. It is certain people who, and this is a problem that I have, is this push for recognition of Palestine as a state. Okay, on the one hand, I would say recognizing that the Palestinians deserve their freedom and independence from Israeli occupation, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, very important. However, what kind of project is it to establish a state in the terms of the geopolitical order, that you having the appurtenances of so-called sovereignty under the UN system, have some diplomats and things like that? If you're not, the state is a tool. It's an instrument. It's not an endpoint. It's not a goal for human liberation. It's just one of many ways in which political society can be organized and administered. And usually, as Marx would have said, is that the state is a representation of the class society. So you're going to get a liberal democratic state as the expression of the bourgeois ruling class, the material interest of the economic order. So I think we have to be a little skeptical and a little concerned with thinking about the national liberation in institutionally national terms, in those kind that what you're trying to do is set up political institutions that reflect the nation. That in itself is probably not so important or significant. It highlights the cause of a people who are suffering colonialism. But I think there are a lot of dangers and temptation. And this is something that I happen to have been able to participate in a program where we did some educational work in the West Bank and visited quite a number of places. There were students from the United States and there were students from Palestine as part of a collective course that we ran that had one component that took place in the West Bank and then another in the United States. And I was part of that. And during those discussions, this was like 2006, it had already been some years when I thought the whole Oslo process, the whole so-called peace process, had just, offshored the process of occupation to the PA, the Palestinian Authority. And what was the value of having these quasi-emblems of sovereignty, of statehood, etc., if it just meant that Palestinians were the ones who would have to do the dirty work of policing Palestinians for Israel without having, decision-making control by the people themselves about how they wanted to, structure. And it was security on behalf of Israel, not security for Palestinians. So I said back then, and this was already, I think, some years late, to be recognizing this, I was telling people at the time, you should disband the PA. I mean, of course you can't, because those people have an interest in keeping it. And they've been armed and trained, and they have now resources because some of the customs duties and so on. So all of the oppressive components of a state, they have, and none of the liberatory or beneficial ones, right? But I was saying, you dissolve the PA because it's just used to sort of say, look, well, it's the PA's responsibility. You have an authority, and you're not under the same kind of occupation. I mean, that has subsequently, with the failures of that whole process, now people recognize that it's still occupation. But there was a decade there where it was possible among certain people in certain circles to fabricate an idea, a vain, crazy idea, that Palestinians were no longer really under occupation because they have some form of a quasi-state set of institutions. And obviously it was useless to the Palestinians, and it was just part of their own oppression. So I would say that this issue of distinguishing, where I would make the distinction is particularly on symbols of statehood and sovereignty that are not really real, and institutions of statehood that are not designed to actually reflect the interests of the people for the people. That's when this nationalism just becomes another mechanism and mode for perpetuating colonialism and oppressive forms of capitalism. That we see in lots of post-colonial societies that have not achieved justice, freedom, and equality for their people.
Thank you. It was great that you connected it to the PA and the statehood, all that. I think it was very interesting. Um, it's also like, as a side note, this whole business about, oh, we accept the state of Palestine. I mean, most of the world has done that already. I mean,
Yeah.
just adding a bunch of European countries, what does it do? I mean, it's a symbol question, so it has some symbolic value, I think.
More useful would be withdraw recognition of the state of Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
And say we got to start again with something that's fair and just for all the people who are of this land, right?
Or just stop selling weapons.
Yeah,
I mean, just start there. Like, it all feels very useless and just symbolic carrots, while we have been seeing body parts every day of children. It's unbearable. But and then they come with this, oh, now we accept the state of Palestine. Okay, what does it mean? How does it stop the genocide?
Yeah.
It's not doing anything.
Yeah. We need a humanitarian intervention.
Yeah, exactly.
We need a crusade to save the Palestinians, right?
Yeah, I mean, that would be just.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's more useful. But
Exactly.
that's not exactly what they won't do for all the reasons we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have a couple notes, but I don't know if we have time. Like, we can maybe touch quickly the Crusades and the connection to Renaissance, because Renaissance is talked about as like this, I don't know, burst of jumping through history somehow. Like, suddenly everything became great.
Well, and it's like recovering Greek and Roman culture and skipping over and shuffling off like the dead skin, like a snake does, of this intervening period of medieval era. I mean, I just think history doesn't work that way. I mean, obviously, there were very important developments that took place during those centuries. Sometimes people have said, "Oh, the Crusades had introduced people to the East, and there were all these kind of cultural exchanges that take place, and there was more contact." There wasn't actually a lot of evidence of, say, translation of text. I mean, these Crusaders seem not to have been, imagine that they didn't seem that interested in Eastern philosophy and mathematics, and they were interested in some technical things, obviously, and they were interested in military technology, and it actually was quite a spur to developments in making better weapons and better, catapults, and improving naval. I think that was very important, is the investments that took place in order to, because the first crusade was a land march, right? Different armies took this long route through Eastern Europe, pillaging, slaughtering, killing, causing all kinds of trouble, which is so ironic because I was presenting some of these ideas at a conference in Bosnia, in Sarajevo. And, I started with a picture of these Croatians celebrating a medieval festival in Mostar, wearing, what looks like Crusader outfits of, the white with the red cross, right? And when you think of it, this is the way you affiliate and say we are part of the West, Western Europe. This is how you do it, is that, well, we share this history. In fact, actually, many of these areas were pillaged by these first Crusaders who slaughtered, hated these people, and so on. But in any case, they went over the long, and how, many people did not survive that march and didn't make it. So they decided we need to be able to reinforce this frontier state, this enclave, through maritime provisioning and support and so on. So they invested a lot of money in future attacks and future crusades in building up a navy so that they could carry horses, arms, and men, over for future crusades. This is how they did it, and so that put a lot of investment into military technology, naval technology, things like that. So there were a lot of reasons why that would have developed. But it wasn't this kind of opening of the minds. I think there were some cultural exchanges and so on, but I think the cultural changes happened more in places where there was contact between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, in places like Spain, where they came into more contact and recognized that there was valuable intellectual and advanced material. Often this is characterized as, even in the 12th century, as a renaissance, as the recovery of uh, uh, Greek and ancient knowledge preserved by the Arabs, right? So the Arabs, what they did is they made copies, didn't really read them, understand them, or study them, or develop further on them, but they kept them there so that Europe could have it later as part of its own inheritance. So they were like nice, entrusted. It was an amanet. It was given to them. They kept it, and then they gave it back, right? And this is, of course, ludicrous. What happened was a much more vibrant kind of interaction and exchange, where the European Latin scholars were very interested in the Arabic works. Just as you would be in a scientific culture today, you would want to know English so you can see that's the language in which people publish most, although now Chinese is becoming an extremely important, language for science, technology, and basic research. But okay, let's say the last 20, 30 years, you were a scientist, you probably wanted to learn English and you wanted to publish in English. So that you could have access to whatever the latest, scientific research was. Well, that was Arabic in the 12th and 13th centuries. And so they wanted to know what were the latest Arabic works in geometry and medicine, in all these fields of knowledge. And so that happened in places where you did have contact and mixed societies, not necessarily in places where crusading kind of domination established itself. So I don't think the Renaissance really was connected very closely, although some people say that there were contacts and things, and it led to lots of changes. I think those changes are what's important, that created a kind of culture of trying to learn from the East, appropriate that knowledge, develop it further, and master it. And so it was a stimulus to their Europe's integration into the world economy. Obviously, it did assist that. But what needs to be understood is, in what way did it integrate them? It didn't integrate them just in the kind of forms of trade and contact and exchange. It wasn't Amalfi, as I said. I started with that. Why do we not really hear about Amalfi? Is because they ended up becoming very weak and subordinated and eclipsed by Genoa and Venice, and that model of development, which was based on violence, warfare, colonialism, and domination. And the Crusades were, a kind of stimulus for certain kind of technical and organizational development, that took place. And you can see the continuities between that and, say, for example, the Atlantic world system, the Atlantic world, that, somebody like Christopher Columbus was a Genoese. It's no accident. The Genoese were the biggest slavers in, like, the Mediterranean. They had tried doing sugar plantations in the Latin kingdoms of Jerusalem. That didn't work out so well, and they also were being kicked out. So they did it in Cyprus, tried it in Cyprus, didn't work out as well. It started to work when they tried the same thing in the Canary Islands and in the Azores, and started substituting, the labor for, wiping out indigenous people and substituting labor with enslaved Africans. And it's no accident that somebody like Christopher Columbus was at the forefront of it, because the Genoese were the experts during the era of these Crusades, so that when it came time for the Spanish to look for expertise for how do you colonize, how do you, subordinate and establish the economically lucrative mechanisms of plunder and hegemony, they went to the experts.
And the naval technology. I mean,
And the naval
I
technology,
was
yeah.
going to make that connection, but you already jumped there. So
Yeah.
that naval connection is directly there, I guess. So
Yeah, we circumnavigate. Why do we circumnavigate? Well, firstly, why do we go around Africa, as all of the shipping that needs to go to Israel, thanks to Ansarullah? Why do they have to go all the way around? Well, they could not go the short route. They couldn't go through. And they didn't want to. They wanted to have an independent, kind of source for the riches of the East. And that's why the Red Sea was important. That's why I mentioned that they tried to invade Egypt many times. This was the geostrategic. This is why the British were willing to support, both because they were anti-Semitic and they didn't want Jews from Odessa and Eastern Europe during the pogroms taking place under Tsarist era persecutions of Jews in Eastern Europe and in Russia and Ukraine. They didn't want them flooding as refugees. Again, very worried about these refugees coming. They didn't want these people coming to Britain, and they thought instead we could resettle them in a geostrategically very important location where access to the Indian Ocean world can come, through Suez Canal in Egypt. And of course, it's very close to the Persian Gulf. So it's important to there establish a base when our empire is declining and fragmenting. We still need to reinforce. Let's recruit a new population, because we can't get British people to go and establish themselves there. Let's, cooperate with the Zionist sort of movement. And, so why that didn't work in the past? They weren't able to. They lost. They lost the Crusader states. The Ottoman Empire became strong after the Mamluk Empire, so they needed to circumvent it. So they developed on the technologies that they used to come to dominate naval maritime activity in the Mediterranean for longer and longer journeys, and managed to develop the technology to travel around Africa, which also was exactly the same technologies and techniques that opened up the Atlantic world to colonization and control in the Western Hemisphere. And this is built on, I would say, the crusading model. That it has a contribution to that history.
I think this is very interesting. I haven't heard this talked about in this way before, really. So this was eye-opening and very interesting. I think we talked about most of the things I wanted to talk about. I found this. I mean, it was my bad. It wasn't great organized in the way, like there wasn't a timeline or.
Oh no,
like
it's
but
better.
I think it was good.
Yeah, better to have the free flow. Plus, like, how could you organize? Clearly, you get me going. I just start talking about all these things. I'm very excited and passionate about these, and so I apologize for, to you and to listeners if some of it is just like a stream of a lot of things and it's too much to really grasp, because I'm talking about a lot of history and covering a lot of ground and making a lot of these connections. But I do hope people gain something from it, to be able to see some of the relationship between deeper history and our current situation on a number of different fronts, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's the global war on terror, whether it's like, the situation in Palestine, is to see that there is a longer history that is usually not connected this way. And I hope, soon to publish, more papers and also a book on this. And it'll be easier to follow when it's written and there's more opportunity to see the evidence and the discussion and think about it. But hopefully it gives people an excitement and a foretaste to anticipate that, and that they'll be interested in getting the fuller picture from that work in the future, inshallah.
Inshallah, and they can always revisit this lecture. definitely.
Yes,
I will do that. And you will let us know when the book comes out. So
absolutely.
we can
We can talk more about it then.
that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there
It was a
anything else you
pleasure.
want to add? Or
Well, no, just that I think this kind of history and the history of Muslims in Europe, it's very important. We're facing issues of Islamophobia, and Europe wants to write us out of their history, but there is a long history of interaction, of conflict, but of interaction. There were Muslim populations in Europe, and these kinds of topics also are worth talking about because contemporary Muslims should feel that they have a history that is itself a resource for them in these societies as well. And so, in the future, there are other topics like that we can also talk about and discuss more. But I think basically right now, you cannot understand politics in the West without understanding the Muslim question. I mean, it organizes so much of what's happening. And we need to be, very clear and informed about these things because it's very significant in the struggle to be able to conceptualize how narratives about history are being weaponized, as I think you said earlier. It was a very good phrase, being weaponized against us. And so that's something that we have to educate ourselves on. And so I'd be happy if there are future topics that are connected with this sort of world of discussion, to be thinking and talking more with you and with others in your community about it. I think it's really interesting. And people can also follow us on Guerrilla History. Again, just to remind people of that podcast where history is seen as a resource in our struggle. And you might also check out The Majlis, Majlis, which is another podcast that I do less regularly, but I should do more with. And that is very focused specifically on questions of Islamophobia, Muslim diasporic history and culture, the Middle East and Islamic world topics in general. So people might find that interesting as well.
Yeah, you should definitely check both out. And they're in wherever podcasts are.
That's right, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts.
Yeah. And I do follow Guerrilla History regularly, and it's as I said, it's been a great tool of education for me, especially as a I have a small child, so it's like being a parent of a 2-year-old. You don't have so much time to sit down and read. Exactly. So it's been great. Actually.
Yeah, nobody does these days, so that's why we started. We thought let's talk about some of these things in a manner when you can be folding the laundry or doing the dishes or taking care of it and still be thinking about important and interesting things, But I've enjoyed it very much. I've learned also, we hope to do more on YouTube eventually, and so that's also been inspirational to see that you've got a YouTube show, and maybe we'll learn from you and expand in that direction and collaborate and do more things.
Or it will be a bad example that you improve upon. We'll see. We'll see about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah.